Hello, my beautiful fellow space blobs. How are you all doing out there? I am sitting here today feeling extra in my space blobness. I'm a little under the weather. I'm feeling a little extra sensitive, and it's been a really intense winter emotionally for me, and I think for many of us, exploring who we're becoming. I feel like I'm just getting to know myself all over again at this point in my life, which is always such a nice surprise, and also brings with it a lot of reassessment and self-exploration about what really matters in my life and what really brings me to life. And I think one of the big revelations I've been coming to is how I've always kind of felt like if I could just get over kind of my own innate rhythm, which is to move a little slower and a little more gently, and to create from not so much of a place of wanting to conquer or gain a whole bunch of attention or be on top of everything, but rather to create something that's soft and meaningful to me. If I could just get over that and kind of get into more of that kind of boss energy that I would somehow have made it. And I think something that I'm really exploring as we approach this equinox and this first new moon in Aries at 0 degrees, that my definition of a new beginning and a meaningful new beginning has a lot of a different tone than a lot of the stories that we see in movies and in advertising, where new beginnings only equal conquering the world. Being in extroversion, being in hyper mode, being on top of it all, being super direct and forward and outward energy based at all times. And I think this is an important first thing to talk about for this Aries new moon, which is happening on the equinox as we open up a new astrological year with the beginning of Aries season. And as we work with a new moon that is a 0 degree new moon. What does a new beginning mean to each of us? Because it's not always going to be about that kind of movie montage of getting the makeover and taking over the business and being in charge of everything. A new beginning could look like doing healing work and crying a lot. A new beginning could look like doing something really soft. A new beginning could feel like the end of something where we do less of something or where we let go of something. A new beginning could also look like extroversion or excitement about a new project. But regardless of, any of these examples, what does a new beginning mean to you and to your own innate rhythmic patterns and the way that you move through life? I think it's so important when we're working with symbolically rich moments like this, like a 0 degree new moon at the beginning of an astrological new year, that we make it our own and we don't feel like it has to feel one specific way or look one specific way. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Also, just keep in mind for this new moon, we're having a 0 degree new moon here on March 21st in Aries. And then we're going to have a second new moon in Aries. And that new moon is going to happen on April 29th at 29 degrees of Aries. And that's also a total solar eclipse. And Australia is going to get the show. And that corner of the world is going to get the show this time. But we are going to be working with 2 new moons in Aries. So this is just the first of 2. And it really is working so well with the cycle that we've been working with the moons, where we've had a new moon in Pisces, the full moon in Virgo, and now the new moon in Aries. So this really completes our conversation through that lunar cycle and what that's really meant for us. So let's talk a little bit about what this new moon is all about. So it's happening on March 21st. 0 degrees of Aries, as I've mentioned probably 10 times by now. And it's going to be quite close to Mercury in Aries, 5 degrees away, but still close enough that I think we can have a conversation about that. I think when you have a new moon this close to Mercury in the sign of Aries, there is a lot of new dreams coming into focus. There is a lot of that kind of fresh insight, fresh ideas, fresh motivation, fresh perspective on where we are setting our sights and what paths we are wanting to take. There is a creative and inventive element to a conversation with a new moon and Mercury like this in the sign of Aries. For me, Aries, yes, it's often about like determination and is often associated with things like competitiveness and ego. But I also think more innocently and more truly, Aries is really about the courage it takes to follow our own path and to be willing to initiate that path in the way that is innate to each of us. And I think that's going to be a really big part of this new moon. The other conversation that's happening in this little moment in time is that Aries, Jupiter and Chiron are quite close together in Aries at this time as well. And they've been kind of hanging out close together for a few weeks at this point. But there's been a theme going on with Jupiter and Chiron hanging out so close together, which has to do with our self-acceptance. It has to do with the fact that when we engage with the parts of ourselves that we may think of as flaws, as weak, as the thing we just need to get over in order to be successful, in order to be daydreamers, in order to have new beginnings, that we embrace those parts of ourselves, because those are the parts of ourselves that will actually allow us to engage in our own path in the way that it is meant for each of us. So there's a really strong emphasis here on accepting ourselves the way that we are, and on accepting our own innate rhythm and the way that we connect with what it means to have fresh ideas, fresh insights, and new perspectives. And while the Pisces new moon we were working with a month ago was all about taking that sacred breath and being present with it, taking that moment to just look around in the quiet, this new moon is about taking a look around at the ingredients waiting to be worked with right here, right now. And I think a big part of this new moon is going to be about discernment. And the discernment of what we want to take with us, and the discernment of what we do not, and also what is really feeding our souls and what is not. And I have some questions to explore. Like, what would happen if we weren't using so much of our energy to control and force ourselves through our lives? I think this is really the essential question of this new moon, because Aries energy is a lot about how we go out there in the world and do our thing. We show up to the conversation, to the table of life. You know, it really is that energy of being willing to try and go for it and begin. And it's very vulnerable in that way. I think Aries energy in some ways is some of the most vulnerable energy we have, because it's the part of us that's willing to begin, the part of us that's willing to open the door and be there in all of our, just who we are. But I think that, you know, so often we feel like we have to put on a costume, we have to put on a performance, we have to control ourselves, we have to force ourselves, we have to make it right. And one of the things that I hope we can explore during this new moon is what would happen if we didn't try and control ourselves into the image of who we think we need to be, into the dreams we think we need to be dreaming, into the pathways we think we need to continue to forge ahead. I think along with that, if we have fears and shame around being ourselves, this is a beautiful new moon to kind of sit with those parts of ourselves that are longing to maybe do things in our innate rhythm, in our own way, to allow ourselves to not keep doing the same routine because we know it doesn't feel good, and allowing ourselves to really honor that maybe we have changed and the paths that we do want to follow and the things that we do want to pursue don't necessarily line up with the image that we have of ourselves and the control we need to have over who we are and how we show up to life. I think it's also a really beautiful new moon to ask, you know, all that control that we put on ourselves, the way that we force ourselves to make it through the day and force ourselves to make everything happen in a week, is all that force doing what we think it is doing? Is it keeping everybody together? Is it keeping everybody else on their feet? Is it making everybody else as comfortable as we think it's making them? Because odds are that all this self-control and all this force that we often put on ourselves to perform and to be somebody in the world and to do all of that isn't doing what we think it's doing. You know, we're putting all this pressure on ourselves. We're making sure we're getting it done. We're showing sure we're showing up in a certain way. But many of the rules that we put on ourselves are ones that we've made up ourselves. We didn't confer with any of the people around us in community and say, is this really helping you? Not that we need to do that. We don't need to go around asking everybody if the way we're acting is appropriate for every person. My point being that a lot of times we come up with the ways we control ourselves without really knowing if it's actually doing the thing we think it's doing. So this is a really great new moon as well to just take the pressure off of where we think we need to perform, where we think we need to force ourselves to be something, and where we think we need to force the road ahead. And instead, I hope that we can take a moment during the 0-degree new moon to take the pressure off of that, take the pressure off of the performance, take the pressure off of living in a certain identity, and allow ourselves to explore what is naturally flowing out of us and naturally flowing towards us and what we don't have to force. And I know culture is going to say, well, if somebody isn't using self-control and discipline and force, like nothing would get done in this world, but that's not true. That's not true. Most of us, when we give ourselves a sacred moment to breathe and feel and connect with ourselves, we feel inspired. We feel curious about something. And most of us, when we trust ourselves enough and respect ourselves enough and respect our inner creative spark enough and let it lead us a little bit more, if we sit down on the couch for a little while, we will start to get those new rumblings of the next right step and the next right move, and we'll want to do it. So I think it's also about just trusting ourselves a little bit more and stepping more into that trust. And I think also this is a great new moon for accepting the ways that we have changed. We're going to continue talking about that, both with the Libra full moon and with the second Aries new moon and the beginning of eclipse season. We're going to have a lot more conversations around self-acceptance of who we are now. But this new moon is really about just exploring how we're trying to control ourselves, how we're trying to perform ourselves into safety, and how we're trying to keep ourselves safe by doing the best performances we can and just exploring those themes. I'm going to be doing on Patreon a more detailed journal prompting self-exploration activation for this new moon. So if you're looking for a little more support, I'd love to see you there. It's going to be a really, really cozy chat. And we're also exploring Pluto moving around this month over on my Patreon in the upper tier. So if you're looking for a little more support, I'd love to see you there. Now let's get into these cards. I'm using the Cat Tarot. I love this deck. It is so sweet. My sister got it for me last year. It's by Megan Lynn Cott. And it is just the sweetest deck of cards. It's got humor and whimsy, and I think just adds a new perspective. And I'm already like dropping half the deck on my lap here. So I thought it would be really fun to bring in a little whimsy and fun into our chat today. I'm needing the whimsy as I just let myself be myself, imperfect, sitting here, feeling vulnerable, a little under the weather, a little sensitive, accepting myself the way that I am. It's pretty deep, y'all. It's pretty deep. Accepting that the road will lead where it will if I just let myself be who I am. Awkward and everything in between. Okay, so we have the Ten of Swords, which is a cat climbing a screen. I like that interpretation of Ten of Swords quite a bit. Very fitting, I think, with the moon cycle we've just been moving through with that Pisces new moon, Virgo full moon, and then Aries new moon. These like kind of 29 and 0-degree moons that we're having on the new moons is really, really poetic in endings and beginnings and release and opening. Release of pressures, the Empress. I'm going to pull one more card. And I think there's a lot of that going on right now as we move through March, as we move toward a new spring opening up, and the Fool. Look at that. Beautiful kitty. I love this deck so much. Okay, let's talk about it. So, yeah, the Ten of Swords, as we know, in this deck, obviously, the cat has climbed up the screen and is in an interesting position where he's going to have to release soon. But Ten of Swords is all about culmination and release. And I know that many of us will look at that card, and in the traditional deck, it's a guy who's been stabbed in the back many times and is laying there. But for me, it's the beautiful release of not having to hold up the routine anymore, of not having to hold up the performance and the visage of a specific person, of not having to hold up the performance to ourselves of what a new beginning needs to look like and who we have to be in order for a new beginning to be valid or satisfying or valuable. And I think that's really important in this new moon, is just letting go of all those pressures we have on what it would mean to have the best new moon experience, and therefore to access this other aspect of it, the Empress and the Fool. These two are so much about what feeds us and nourishes us in life, what comes to us easily, what comes to us naturally, what is not forced. And also what sparks that curiosity to start again and begin new. And I know a lot of times we talk about new moons as time of journaling and intention setting. And I do think this is a moon of that. But I think what's important about it is the intentions really have to be true. They have to have kind of this innocence to them, where we're not trying to figure out how to get to the end game. We're not trying to figure out how to make it so that it looks good to other people. It's something that's really true from within us. So that can be a really fun exercise to do. We've taken away all the markers of success or notoriety or respectability or responsibility that maybe we feel those around us expect of everybody. And we allow that Fool energy to speak to us, our spirit speak to us. What does it actually show us if we're not afraid of how others are going to judge us? And I think this will be a really interesting new moon in that regard, in letting go of performances and then embracing what we're really wishing for. I think that can be really soulful and meaningful. Like I said, I'm going to be having another chat about this new moon, walking us through it over on my Patreon, which is really the space that's allowing me to keep showing up here as well. But also every comment and like helps me so much. It helps me be able to do the work of redefining this whole world of astrology and tarot and make it much more about the soulful expression of life, and that so much of this is about poetry and ways to express the ineffable in the world. And so it really helps me. Every like, every subscribe, every comment helps me to do that work and get my message across and just share the space blob message for all of us that don't fit into a nice tidy category in this life, which who does, really, at the end of the day. So I would really love it if you could help me out with that. I will see you all so soon for our next full moon, for Aries season up ahead. There's so much to look forward to as we begin a new astrological year, and I am so appreciative for every single one of you sitting here with me today. Have a beautiful new moon in Aries.